We just heard the account of Jesus' transfiguration. I'll come to that at the very end. But to begin, I'd like to invite you to go back to Sunday. Many of us heard a reading from the book of Job, from the 19th chapter. Before those verses that were read in our churches this last Sunday, we hear from Job himself, and he is in a very dark place. He's lost his health, he's lost his wealth, he's lost his family. He says, my wife despises the very breath I breathe. He's hit rock bottom. He's in a dark, dark place. And you know who he blames for it all? God. And Job is like someone in a courtroom, pacing back and forth outside the courtroom, just chomping at the bit. He wants his day in court. He wants God in the witness stand to explain what happened there, what went wrong. In the midst of the tantrum and the darkness, Job says, I know that my Redeemer lives. At the last day he will stand upon the earth, and I shall see my friend and not a stranger. In the midst of death, an acclamation of life, a glimpse of resurrection. Centuries later, the same sentiment is echoed by a Dutch woman named Corrie ten Boom. Some of you may have heard of her. She and her family hid Jews during World War II, protecting them from the Nazis. In the end, Corrie ten Boom and her family were all taken to prison camps. They all died there, except for Corrie. Or, turns out, it was a clerical error, but she was released. And for the rest of her life, to anyone who would listen, she had one simple message. There's no well so deep, nor hole so dark, that God is not there with you. I know, she would say. I've been there. Sometimes it's in those dark moments that we catch a glimpse of the resurrection. Sometimes it's in those deep wells that we experience God's healing grace. Or even in the midst of death, there's life. So I want to share with you today two experiences from my own life that echo that sentiment. I was ordained priest at Church of the Ascension in Pueblo, Colorado. I was a curate there. The priest had been there 25 years, ordained 35 years. He was to be my mentor. I wasn't a very good student, but we got along. One of my duties there was to go to the two hospitals in Pueblo, one Roman Catholic, one Episcopalian. So twice a week I went to one, twice a week to the other one. I learned during one of my visits that the head nurse at one of the Roman Catholic wings was the wife of a parishioner, Mr. Strachan. Mr. Strachan was also the uncle of a good friend of mine. He was one of those quiet types. He wasn't on the vestry, he wasn't on a committee, but like clockwork, every Sunday, right back there, he sat. He was faithful every Sunday. And I noticed that he always sat alone. His wife never sat with him. So I asked Father Minnick, I said, how come Mr. Strachan's wife never comes? Father Minnick said, she claims to be an agnostic. She's bitter towards the church. She's never come to any church as far as I know. Okay. Well, one day when I was visiting the Roman Catholic hospital, I looked at the list of Episcopalians in the hospital, and in spite of claiming to be an agnostic, she put down Ascension as her church. So I went to go visit her, and as my custom was, I stopped by the nurse's station first, and I said, well, Father, she's having surgery now, but she'll be back in a couple hours. It's fine. So 2 days later, I'm back there. Her name's on the list. So I went to go visit. But when I got to the room, there's a great big sign with exclamation points there. All visitors see head nurse before entering this room. Okay, I'm not stupid. So I went and talked to Sister Nancy, and she said, Father, physically, Mrs. Strachan is doing fine. Emotionally, she's a mess. She's used to being the head nurse in charge of everything. Being treated by her staff that work for her is not something she's taking very lightly. The hospital chaplain came to see her. She threw the Bible at him and screamed at him. She shouted expletives at every nurse that's gone in there. We thought you should know that before you go in. Okay. So I went to her room. I peeked. She was asleep. God bless you. Amen. My duty's done. God knew how to take care of her. I wouldn't have no Bible thrown at my head. 2 days later, I came back. She's still on the hospital list. But when I got to her room, there's no sign. But I'm not a slow learner. I still went to the nurse's station, and I said, Mrs. Strachan, is she okay? They said, Father, she's waiting for you. You won't believe the change. So I went in. She's sitting up in bed. She's alive. She's bright. She says, come in, come in. I was hoping you'd show up. Have a seat. And we visit for a bit. And then she points to a jar on her nightstand. Says, look at that. Well, I looked at it. I had no idea what I was looking at. There were some gross pieces of body that I assume had been in her at one point that were now out. To tell the truth, it looked like kind of petrified poop. But this woman I knew was very into Jungian typology. So I'm thinking, what would the great psychologist Carl Jung say about these things in the jar? And I came up with a couple of guesses, and she laughed at me, and she said, no, look. You know what that is? I said, no. She said, feces. And then I must have just looked stunned, because maybe she thought that was too big a word for me. She says, crap. She said, that's what I made out of my life. That's all I have to show for my life. I'm rid of it now. I'm ready to make a new start in life, learn what life is all about. I want to know about God. Tell me about Jesus. And we had a long talk right there. And the next Sunday, when I came down the aisle, her husband was sitting there. She was next to him. And as far as I know, for the rest of her life, every Sunday, she was there. In what turned out to be one of the darkest moments of her life, that's where she met God. That's where she learned that there's a power higher than herself. That's where she learned to let go and let God. I left to the far western part of the state, but I'm always grateful that God allowed me to be part of that turning in her life. The other story takes place in Ascension Pueblo as well. Father Minnick really was a good mentor. I did not take as good advantage of it as I should have. But he was also an irritating man. He was very controlling. For example, our offices were side by side. If I was on the phone having a conversation, the way the old phone system was set up, he could pick it up in his office, listen in, and then take over the conversation, which he did every time. If I had a young couple in my office want to talk about getting married, he'd just throw the door open, walk in, have a seat, and take over the conversation. Everything had to be just his way. If you had any doubt, all you had to do was go in the church, look up at the altar area up front. Everything was immaculate. But if you picked up the bishop's chair and moved it, you would find a little index card here saying bishop's chair here, acolyte's bench here, cross there. Everything had to be exactly where Father Minnick wanted it to be. Probably the most irritating of all traits, every Tuesday we had a staff meeting. Every Tuesday the same thing happened. Lois, the church secretary, had worked for Father Minnick for 17 years. Every Tuesday he would get the bulletin and say, Lois, that is not right. That should be centered. That should be capitalized. You left off a word. And he berated her every Tuesday. Every Tuesday, Lois hung her head. I'm sorry. Mind you, today, if you make a mistake, you just backspace on the computer. Back then, Lois typed a stencil. and then ran off the mimeograph machine. So that was a lot of work to correct any mistake, and the bulletins just went out with errors. Well, a couple of months after I was ordained priest there, Father Minnick and his wife went on a trip to England. It was a gift from the parish to celebrate his being there 25 years. He had yearned to go to England his whole life. It was a trip of a lifetime. I expected he would come back just filled with stories and what a blessing the trip had been. In fact, it was a horrible trip. He was sick the whole time, nauseous most of the time. He came back, went to his own doctor, didn't know what was going on, sent him to a specialist in Denver, couldn't figure out what was going on. And 50 years ago, we didn't have the diagnostic tools we have now, so they suggested exploratory surgery. He must have suspected this was serious, because before the operation, he asked to meet with his son. And he said to him, in essence, "Son, I've not been the father I should have been for you. Can you forgive me?" And his son forgave him. He had a similar conversation with his daughter. He had a similar but more difficult conversation with his wife, and said, being a priest wife for 35 years, and I didn't make it any easier. Can you forgive me? She did. And then he asked for the bishop to come and hear his confession, which he did. Then he went to the operating room. When they opened him up, they found every organ of his body had cancer. They simply sewed him up again and sent him home. Father Minnick never celebrated the Eucharist again. He came during Holy Week and sat in the congregation. That's the closest he came back to the altar again. After Easter, his wife Caroline asked, "Chauncey would like you to come bring him Easter communion. Can you do that?" Well, yeah. So the next day, I showed up. His wife greeted me at the door, and she said, "He's waiting for you." He was sitting in his study. I walked into his room. He was sitting in his recliner right in the middle of the room. And I stood there, and I don't know how to describe what I saw, except that there seemed to be kind of an inner glow within him. And in a flash, I realized two things. One, God was saying to me, as he did to Moses, "Take off your shoes. You're standing on holy ground." And I realized that the Chauncey Minnick I was looking at that moment was the Chauncey Minnick God had known and loved through his whole life. I saw him as God saw him, with that glow from within. And then everything was back as it is here now. That experience has stayed with me forever. And if I doubted that it was just a bad breakfast that day, the next day, mid-morning, Carolyn Minnick showed up. She went straight to the church office. And she said, "Lois, I have something for you." And she said, "Chauncey asked me to give this to you." It was the Easter bulletin. He had written on the front cover, in a handwriting that was distinctively his, "Thank you, Lois. A perfect bulletin!" Exclamation point. She sobbed. She had waited 17 years for that affirmation. His dying gift was to give it to her. The reading from Job, Corrie ten Boom, all remind us there's no well so deep nor hole so dark that God is not there with us. And that is the good news for us today.